It's the trial of the neo-Nazis and white supremacists responsible for the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. As you know, a vehicle plowed into Heather Heyer, killing her. And I'm actually preparing a report for Nightline on the civil trial, and heading to Charlottesville on Friday, which is where we find our next guest, Amy Spitalnik. She's been in Charlottesville, she told me, week 4 and counting, and will be there throughout the duration of the trial. And, in many ways, the groundbreaking trial is taking place right now. So I want to bring in Executive Director of Integrity First for America, Amy Spitalnik, in Charlottesville. Hey, Amy.
Hi, Juju.
As we said off camera, this is a trial that you could talk about for ages. But first, give us the overview of the case and what makes it such a landmark lawsuit.
Absolutely. Well, look, at the end of the day, this is a case that's about accountability and justice. What happened 4 years ago here in Charlottesville was not an accident. It was violence that was motivated by racism, by anti Semitism, and by other forms of hate. And the violence was planned meticulously in advance, down to discussions of hitting protesters with cars, and then, of course, attempts to chalk it up to self defense. And so this case is really about accountability for the 24 individuals and hate groups most directly responsible for what happened, justice for our plaintiffs, for this community. I think we all remember viscerally watching those images from 4 years ago. Nazis with tiki torches, specifically chosen to evoke the Nazis and the KKK, chanting things like "Jews will not replace us" on that Friday night. And then, of course, on Saturday, a day of violence that culminated in the car attack. And what happened, as I said, was no accident, but rather it was planned in advance. These extremists then came to Charlottesville to engage in the violence, and then they celebrated the violence afterwards as, quote, a huge moral victory and payback time. And so in this lawsuit, we are using a statute known as the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, passed 150 years ago to deal with Klan violence in the South, and sadly having a renaissance in the year 2021 because of resurgent white supremacy. And it's about making clear that there will be consequences for this sort of violent hate.
And I think you basically answered my next question. So I'll sort of rephrase it a little, which is, you mentioned the Ku Klux Klan law statute. It hasn't been used very much. In many ways, this trial is being referred to as path-breaking, groundbreaking in many ways. In what ways do you see it breaking new ground potentially?
Yeah, look, right now, this is the only legal effort taking on the full leadership of this movement, the full leadership responsible for what happened in Charlottesville 4 years ago, that unsurprisingly is deeply connected in the center of this broader, violent, alt-right, white supremacist movement. We know historically civil litigation has played a crucial role in accountability and justice when it comes to these sorts of hate groups. And what's unique about our case is that it really takes on that full leadership. And that's important for so many reasons. It's important because accountability has been sorely lacking in recent years. I think people are generally shocked when they realize there has been so little accountability in the aftermath of Unite the Right, a handful of criminal cases, but the leadership responsible has not really faced the consequences. And this case does that. And it's also important because we know that cases like this, the financial, operational consequences, can create a deterrent to others who are looking on and understanding that if they participate in this sort of violence and extremism, they too will face consequences.
You did it again. You answered my third question, which is how do you see, these efforts to bankrupt these groups as almost as you say a deterrent effect? I mean, what kind of dent might it make in the surge of these violent white supremacist groups? And give us a sense of who some of these groups are that are named plaintiffs in this case.
Yeah, look, the defendants in this lawsuit are, in some cases, household names. People like Richard Spencer, who coined the term alt-right, groups like National Socialist Movement, which is one of the largest neo-Nazi groups in the country, people like Matthew Heimbach, Matt Parrott, Jeff Scoop, groups like League of the South, certain Klan groups, the paramilitary armed tactical wing of the Proud Boys, for example. And some of these defendants have already faced very real consequences. Richard Spencer has called this case, quote, financially crippling. Defendants have talked about how it's undermined their ability to go about their business, forced their organizations to cut operations or to not participate in certain subsequent violent events. A number of defendants have faced large financial sanctions for so flagrantly flouting court orders. We've won evidentiary sanctions, which means that some of the core facts of this lawsuit are now already established against 2 key defendants. We've won default judgments against 7 defendants. And so even already, this case has had a very significant impact on these defendants financially, operationally, legally. And by hopefully winning large financial judgments against the defendants from a jury when this trial is through, it can effectively bankrupt, disrupt, and dismantle these groups and these leaders. And that's important not just because of the accountability that they should face and the justice our plaintiffs and the Charlottesville community deserve, but because of the message it sends, the precedent it sends, that again, there will be consequences for this sort of violent hate.
And so what for you has been the takeaway? In other words, you mentioned some of these evidentiary rulings. What have you learned in getting access to that information?
So we are now in week 3 of trial, week 4 of our team being here in Charlottesville. And even after 4 years of our team being steeped in the evidence in this case and this sort of hate and violence, I think listening to the testimony day in and day out is still shocking. It's still horrifying. The defendants have spoken from the witness stand in court admiringly about Hitler. They've dropped the N-word in court. They've made jokes on the stand with each other about Hitler. They literally, one neo-Nazi defendant asked another about his favorite Holocaust joke. We had Deborah Lipstadt, who's President Biden's nominee as special envoy to combat anti-Semitism, and obviously a nationally renowned expert on anti-Semitism. She was an expert witness in our case, and she testified that she was even taken aback by the level of hate that fuels these groups. And I think no less shocking, really, is the mountain of evidence that our team has started to present, illustrating the violence that was always the intent here. The discussions of this violence as a, quote, racial holy war. The fact that the ex-girlfriend of one defendant testified that he would come home from his day job at an extermination company and talk about how he wished he was exterminating Jews. And they went to a party at Richard Spencer's house weeks before Unite the Right, where there was active discussion of hitting protesters with cars. They talked about cracking skulls, about using flagpoles as spears. And so it is even deeper and darker and more horrifying than I think anyone could ever have imagined when they saw the violence unfold 4 years ago. And I think for me, it also is a reminder of how incredibly courageous our plaintiffs are. 9 people who were injured in this violence, who are willingly reliving their trauma, reliving the worst days of their life in order to hold accountable those responsible. And so as horrific as it is, it also gives me some hope and inspiration just watching our incredible plaintiffs willingly relive that trauma to fight for the justice and accountability they deserve.
You know, right before joining this call, I talked to Heather Heyer's mom, and she was talking about how her daughter died, you know, doing something not that heroic in her mind. Like she kept saying, let's not make my daughter a saint, but I said to her, being an ally and standing up and doing the right thing is heroic. And that is what you're suggesting these plaintiffs are doing by standing up in court and speaking the truth. And yet, one final question to you. Do you draw a connection between the anti-Semitism and the racism and the anti-immigrant ideology that seems to have been motivating?
Yeah, you can't separate these forms of hate. And I'm sure that I know this has been talked about over the course of the conference over the last few days, but all of these ideologies are wrapped up in the white supremacy that is, I think, the most, you know, to quote the Department of Homeland Security, the most persistent and lethal threat to our country right now. Anti-Semitism is at the core of this, with this idea of replacement theory, this idea that Jews are the puppet masters, actively orchestrating a white genocide, the replacement of the white race through support for these other communities, support for Black and Brown communities, immigrants, refugees, anyone who doesn't fit into these extremist, vile, and narrow definition for what this country should be. And 4 years ago in Charlottesville, it was shocking when there were neo-Nazis with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us," speaking specifically to this conspiracy. But I think what should be equally shocking is how normalized this ideology has become over the last few years. We now see it on primetime Fox News with Tucker Carlson espousing it nearly every night, with elected officials giving it a sort of a stamp of approval. Um, and that makes it all the more important that we show there is consequence for this sort of violent hate, that the people who heard this idea, Jews will not replace us, as a call to battle, as Deborah Lipstadt called it when she testified the other day, that there will be consequences if you are motivated by this anti-Semitism, by this racism, by this extremism, and you violently attack people. If you plan violence, engage in that violence, celebrate that violence, it won't go unanswered. And that's what this case is all about.
Well, Amy, thank you so much for your work and for joining us tonight from Charlottesville. And I look forward to seeing you face to face on Friday.
Thank you so much, Juju.